I never thought my last breath would be a sacrifice for a dying alien. The thought ran through James Dawson's mind as he crouched beside the strange girl lying in the cold, dust-filled cave. His breath was ragged, the oxygen supply running low as he glanced at the last tank of breathable air he had. The world around him was crumbling, but his focus was entirely on the girl before him. Her skin was a deep shade of blue, like the ocean at twilight, and her eyes glowed softly in the dim light, filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. The planet's atmosphere was harsh, and the air was thinning by the second, but somehow she still clung to life. She wasn't just any alien. She was the key to everything. He couldn't ignore the fact that saving her might be his only shot at redemption, at survival. He wasn't supposed to care. The orders were simple: survive, complete the mission, and come back. But the moment he saw her, broken and vulnerable, something shifted in him. She was a princess of a galaxy-spanning empire, abandoned and alone in a world that didn't care if she lived or died. As he kneeled there, James made a choice, one that would forever change the course of his life. His hand shook as he opened the valve on his last oxygen tank, watching it hiss softly as it flowed into her mask. He knew what it meant. He might not make it out alive, but at that moment, it didn't matter. She was fighting for air, her breath shallow, but as the oxygen took hold, something in her seemed to shift. Her eyes fluttered, and for the briefest moment, she met his gaze with an expression that held more gratitude than words could express. Her voice came out in a weak whisper, a language he didn't fully understand, but the tone was unmistakable. "Thank you." James leaned back against the cold, jagged rock wall, his body screaming for oxygen. The tightness in his chest was unbearable, and dizziness was already creeping in. But he couldn't let her die, not when she had a chance. "Hang on," he murmured to her. "You're not alone anymore." The silence of the cave was broken by the sound of engines in the distance, low at first, then growing louder. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he struggled to his feet, his head spinning. Through the dust, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Dark shadows, massive warships, cutting through the sky above. Dozens of them. They were coming for her, and they were coming because of him. He had no idea what these ships were or why they were here, but he knew one thing for sure. He had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The girl, the alien princess, wasn't just a random survivor. She was their future, their salvation, and he had unknowingly become part of her story. James looked down at the girl once more. She was breathing steadily now, her life saved by the simple act of kindness. He didn't know what would happen next, but as the sky filled with warships, he realized that whatever it was far bigger than the two of them. James staggered to his feet, the dizziness threatening to take him down again, but the sight of the warships above kept him rooted to the spot. He didn't know what kind of ships they were or why they were there, but he could feel the weight of their presence like a heavy, oppressive force. His eyes darted back to Liana, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The oxygen tank he had given her was working, but how long would it last? How long would they last? The sky above seemed to darken as the ships drew closer, their engines humming with a power that reverberated through the ground. James tried to focus, his mind racing through possible scenarios, but every thought felt clouded by the overwhelming fatigue and the shortness of breath in his chest. He looked up, his pulse quickening as the first of the ships descended, cutting through the dusty air. They were massive, their sleek, dark hulls gleaming under the weak light. There was no way to tell how many there were, but the numbers were staggering. James had seen military ships before, but nothing like this. These were ships of war, ships of command, and they were all pointing toward the very spot where he stood. This is it, James thought to himself. The realization hit him like a cold slap. There was no turning back now. These ships weren't just here for the girl. They were here for him, too. He had no idea what they wanted or how they even knew he was here, but one thing was certain. The moment he helped Liana, he had made himself a target. He stumbled back toward her, crouching beside her fragile form, his hands trembling as he touched her shoulder, his mind swirling with confusion and fear. "What now?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. Liana's eyes fluttered open, and she gazed up at him with those bright, glowing eyes that had so captivated him. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that James couldn't ignore. "They're coming for you," she said. Her words sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't been sure what to expect when the ships arrived, but he hadn't anticipated hearing those words from her. She didn't seem frightened, not in the way he had expected. Instead, she looked almost resigned. Who? James asked, his voice hoarse. My people, Liana replied, her voice steady despite the situation. They're coming to reclaim me. James's heart skipped a beat. This was more than just a rescue. This was a declaration. The alien princess, the one he had saved, was more important than he had ever realized. And now, he was tied to her fate. The warships began to lower toward the ground, the engines roaring with a deafening intensity. James knew he had little time to act. He glanced around, trying to make sense of the situation, but all he could see were the ships and the girl lying before him. He had no idea what to do, no plan, no backup. He was just a soldier, stranded on a foreign planet with nothing but a dying alien and an army about to descend on him. But in that moment, as he looked at Liana, he realized something. He couldn't just leave her. Not now. Not after everything he had already done. And so, with no idea what the future held, James made a decision. He would protect her, no matter what. James felt the ground tremble beneath him as the warships hovered overhead, their engines humming with an almost predatory rhythm. He crouched beside Liana, his mind racing. He had made the decision to protect her, but the enormity of that choice was sinking in fast. She was no ordinary alien. She was royalty, and the forces above him were not here for a peaceful reunion. The ships loomed larger, casting dark shadows across the rocky terrain. The air was thick with tension. He could hear their engines roaring, but there was no way to know what their next move would be. Liana's breathing was steady now, her oxygen levels stabilized, but her eyes were clouded with something deeper, an uncertainty James couldn't quite place. You should go, she said quietly, her voice barely audible against the deafening hum of the ships. You don't know what they will do to you. James looked at her, confusion swirling in his chest. I'm not leaving you, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. I'll stay with you. We'll face whatever's coming together. Her eyes softened, but there was a flicker of sadness in them. You don't understand. My people, they won't see you as an ally. They'll see you as a threat. The word struck James like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on helping her, so focused on saving a life, that he hadn't considered the consequences of his actions. He was a soldier. He was trained to fight, to survive, but not for something like this. He wasn't prepared to face an entire fleet of warships, especially not for an alien princess he had just met. But as he looked at Liana, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back on her now. Not after everything. They won't hurt you. Not as long as I'm here, James said, though he wasn't sure if he believed the words himself. Liana's expression shifted. She reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on his arm. Her touch was soft, almost fragile, and yet it carried a weight that James could feel deep in his bones. You don't know what they're capable of, she whispered, her eyes flickering up to the ships that now filled the sky. I wish I could protect you the way you've protected me. James shook his head. You don't have to protect me. I'm here to protect you. He stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on the ships. There was no turning back now. The sound of the warship's engines intensified, and James knew they were about to land. There was no time to think, no time to make a plan. He had to act now. He didn't have a weapon, but he had his courage, and that was all he needed. He stepped in front of Liana, standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. He had no idea what would happen when the ships landed, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. The warships touched down with a force that rattled the ground, their massive metal hulls casting long shadows over the rocky landscape. James didn't flinch. He kept his eyes fixed on the hatch as it slowly began to open. He was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head on. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation as the first figure stepped out of the ship. A tall figure, draped in dark armor, their movements precise and deliberate. James couldn't make out their face, but there was no mistaking the authority in their stance. This was someone important. Someone who would determine the fate of both him and Liana. The figure approached, their footsteps steady, their presence commanding. James stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve was unwavering. He would protect her, no matter the cost. The figure that stepped out of the ship was tall, their presence almost palpable. Clad in dark, sleek armor that seemed to absorb the light around them. They moved with the precision of someone who had seen countless battles. The hatch hissed shut behind them, and the quiet of the desert seemed to deepen, as if holding its breath. James didn't flinch, but his mind raced. This was no ordinary alien. This was someone important, someone who would decide what happened next. Liana, still weak, seemed to shrink back, her bright eyes locked on the newcomer. The armored figure stopped just a few feet from James, their stance commanding yet not overtly aggressive. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, the tension thick between them. The figure's voice broke the silence, low and resonant. "You are the human who saved her." It wasn't a question, more of a statement, but James answered anyway. Yes. His voice was steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through him. The figure's eyes, hidden behind a visor, seemed to narrow. "And now you stand in defiance of an entire fleet." James met their gaze without hesitation. "I stand in defiance of nothing. I'm protecting her." He gestured toward Liana, who remained still, her expression unreadable. The figure glanced at her briefly, then back at James. "You have no idea what you are involved in, human." There was a weight in their voice, an unspoken threat that sent a shiver down James's spine. But he didn't waver. "Then help me understand," he said. "I'm not leaving her. I don't care who you are or what you represent." The figure paused, as if weighing his words, then let out a soft sigh. "Very well," they said, stepping closer, their boots kicking up dust with each movement. "But know this. What you have done by saving her has consequences beyond your comprehension." Liana's hand found James's, her grip weak but resolute. She turned her head slightly, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You don't know what you're risking," she whispered. James squeezed her hand, refusing to let go. "I know exactly what I'm risking," he said, his voice unwavering. "But I'm not backing down." The armored figure studied him for a moment longer before speaking again. "You've made your choice, but you are not alone in this." With that, they stepped back, signaling to the other figures who had appeared behind them. Slowly, the rest of the fleet began to descend, their massive forms dwarfing the landscape. James felt his heart race, but he didn't flinch. He stood there, side by side with Liana, ready for whatever would come next. "Come," the figure said, turning toward the ships. "The decision is made. Now you will see the consequences of your actions." James took a deep breath, his resolve firm. As he followed the figure toward the waiting ships, he knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on. There was no turning back now. As they approached the massive ships, the sound of engines reverberated through the air, each step James took echoing in the stillness of the desert. Liana's hand still gripped his, though the pressure was light, like the touch of someone who had nothing left to hold on to. James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility, as though the weight of the universe had shifted onto his shoulders. He had saved her life, but now it seemed like he was stepping into a much larger game, one with consequences far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The figure who had first approached him led them toward the largest of the ships, its sleek hull shimmering in the fading light. There were more of them now, each ship casting a long shadow over the barren landscape. The silence between them was thick, filled with the unspoken understanding that what lay ahead could change everything. As they reached the ramp leading up into the ship, James took a moment to glance at the alien fleet, his thoughts racing. They had come for her, that much was clear. But what did that mean for him? Would they see him as a hero, a simple soldier who had made an impossible choice? Or would he become a pawn in a conflict he didn't understand? Liana seemed to sense his unease. Her voice, though soft, cut through the tension. "I never wanted this for you," she said, her words almost a whisper. James turned to face her, his grip tightening around her hand. "You didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice firm but filled with empathy. "But I made my choice, and I'm not backing down. We're in this together." Liana looked at him, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness. "You don't know what you're involved in," she said quietly. "My people, they will never forgive you for what you've done." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never considered the politics of all of this. He had simply acted to save a life, but now it seemed like that act had placed him on the wrong side of an intergalactic conflict. The armored figure ahead of them paused at the top of the ramp, turning to face James. "You're about to meet the Queen," the figure said, their tone unreadable. "The one you've protected. You will learn the true extent of what you've done." James's heart pounded as they ascended the ramp. The interior of the ship was like nothing he had ever seen. The walls glowed with an ethereal light, and the air was cool and crisp. They moved through the halls with purpose, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft hum of the ship's systems. As they approached the inner chambers, James's thoughts drifted to the moment when Liana had first opened her eyes, the trust she had placed in him. He had no idea what awaited him inside, but one thing was certain. His life had changed forever the moment he decided to help her. The doors to the chamber slid open, revealing a room bathed in soft, golden light. At the far end of the room stood a figure, taller than James, draped in an elegant robe that shimmered with every movement. The Queen. Her skin was a deep, radiant shade of violet, her eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. She regarded him with an unreadable expression, her gaze flickering from him to Liana and back again. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Then, the Queen spoke, her voice calm but filled with authority. "You are the human who saved my daughter," she said, her words laced with an edge that James couldn't quite decipher. James nodded, standing tall. "I did what I had to do." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, James wondered if he had made a mistake. But then, she did something unexpected. She smiled, a small but genuine smile that softened her features. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," she said, stepping forward. "But your actions have proven one thing. You are not like the others." James didn't know what to say, so he remained silent, waiting for her to explain further. The Queen continued, her voice more contemplative now. "My people, the Tan do not easily forgive acts like yours. But you have shown courage, and that is something I can respect." James was taken aback by her words. He had expected anger, maybe even punishment. But this was something else. "What does that mean for me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. The Queen's expression shifted again, and this time, there was a glimmer of something like respect in her eyes. "It means you will not face the consequences alone," she said. "You will stand with us, or you will fall with us. That is the choice you have made." James's mind raced as he processed her words. This was no longer just about saving Liana. This was about choosing sides in a conflict far bigger than he had ever imagined. And as the Queen's gaze fixed on him, he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The Queen's gaze remained fixed on James, her violet eyes piercing through the dim light of the chamber, assessing him in ways that made him feel both exposed and oddly empowered. He stood silently, waiting for her next words, unsure of where this path was taking him. Liana was still at his side, though her presence felt distant now, as if the gravity of the situation had put a subtle barrier between them. The Queen finally broke the silence, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "You have made a choice, human. Whether you understand it or not, your actions will shape the future of our people. You will not face this alone, but your fate is now tied to ours." James processed her words slowly. He had already known his life was no longer his own after saving Liana, but hearing it spoken aloud, with the full gravity of the Queen's authority behind it, made everything seem far more real. "What happens now?" he asked, the uncertainty in his voice betraying his steady exterior. The Queen tilted her head slightly, a small but thoughtful gesture. "Now, you prove your loyalty," she said. "You have earned my respect, but respect alone will not be enough in this galaxy. There are those who would see you dead for what you've done, and there are those who would use you for their own gain." James nodded, understanding the unspoken truth in her words. The galaxy was not a place for the weak or the naive. He had already learned that. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The Queen's gaze softened just a touch, though her next words carried the same cold precision as before. "Your first task is to survive, human. Survive, and we will discuss your place in the Tan Dominion. But know this, you will face trials far greater than what you've encountered here, and you will do so as an ally to my people. There is no going back." James felt a weight settle over him, a mix of fear and determination. He had no idea what trials awaited him, but he had already made the decision to stand by Liana, to protect her. That decision had brought him here, and now there was no turning back. The queen gestured toward a large screen on the wall, which flickered to life, displaying a map of the galaxy. Red and yellow markers blinked in. Various sectors, each one representing a different conflict, a different faction vying for power. These are the enemies of the Tan Dominion, she said, her voice taking on a more commanding tone. They have already begun to move against us. And you, human, will help us in our fight. James looked at the map, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of it all. I'm just one man, he said, the words feeling hollow even as they left his mouth. How can I make any difference? The queen's eyes locked onto his, unwavering and intense. It is not the number of soldiers that matters. It is the courage to stand, to fight, and to protect what matters. You have that courage, James Dawson. Her use of his full name sent a shiver down his spine. It was a reminder that he wasn't just a soldier caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was part of something much bigger now. You will face many enemies, human, the queen continued, but you will not face them alone. We will stand together, and together we will reclaim our place in this galaxy. Her words, though heavy with the weight of responsibility, also carried a promise. A promise that James would no longer be alone in this vast, unforgiving universe. The queen turned away from him, her voice now softer but no less commanding. Prepare yourself, human. You will be called upon soon. And when that time comes, you must be ready. With that, the queen dismissed them, her form slipping into the shadows as the doors to the chamber closed silently behind her. James stood still for a moment, his mind racing with everything that had just transpired. He had known the risks when he chose to help Liana, but now the stakes were higher than ever. His fate was tied to hers, and to the Tan Dominion, and he would do whatever it took to survive, to protect her, and to honor the courage he had shown. The journey ahead would be anything but easy, but for the first time since this all began, James felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a part of something much greater, and he would face whatever came next with all the strength he had left. James stood in the dimly lit chamber, his thoughts swirling, as the weight of the queen's words echoed in his mind. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the ship's systems in the background. Liana was beside him, her gaze distant, as if processing everything that had just happened. The door slid open, and a figure stepped inside, breaking the silence. It was the same armored individual who had greeted him earlier. Their presence was commanding, their posture straight, and there was a subtle shift in their demeanor as they approached. You are to follow me, the figure said, their voice devoid of emotion. James nodded, the resolve in his chest hardening. Lead the way, he said, his voice steady, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead still lingered. The armored figure turned and led them through the ship's corridors, their steps echoing softly in the expansive hall. James couldn't help but notice the sophistication of the ship, the smooth, glowing surfaces that reflected the light in strange, otherworldly ways. Everything about it seemed so advanced, yet it felt like a prison, with its sterile environment and the ever-present hum of machinery. As they walked, Liana remained close by his side, her silence a stark contrast to the turmoil James was feeling. He stole a glance at her, wondering if she was as uncertain as he was, but she didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, her expression unreadable. They reached a large chamber, the door sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, a group of individuals stood waiting. They were all alien, their appearances striking and unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking the air of authority that surrounded them. At the center of the room stood a tall figure, their violet skin shimmering in the soft light. The figure's eyes were the same shade as Liana's, but there was something more intense about them, something that sent a chill down James's spine. This was the Queen's inner circle, the ones who would determine his fate. The armored figure stepped aside, and James and Liana were ushered into the room. The tall figure in the center stepped forward, their gaze piercing as they studied James. You are the human who saved the princess, the figure said, their voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. James met their gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. Yes, he replied, his voice unwavering. I did what I had to do. The figure nodded slowly, then turned their gaze to Liana. And you, princess, what do you think of this human's actions? Liana hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering between James and the figure. I I don't know, she said quietly. But he saved my life. The figure seemed to consider this for a moment, then turned back to James. You have done something that has not gone unnoticed. But do not think your actions have been forgotten. You have chosen to stand with us, but you will be tested. The Tan Dominion does not accept weakness. James stood tall, refusing to show any sign of fear. I'm ready for whatever comes next. The figure studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Very well. You will prove yourself in time. But for now, you will remain under our watch. Your actions will determine the role you play in this galaxy. With that, the figure turned and motioned for the others to follow. James and Liana were left standing in the center of the room, the silence stretching between them. James could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that everything had changed. He had made a choice to help Liana, but now the consequences of that choice were unfolding before him. He had no idea what trials awaited him, but one thing was clear. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something much bigger, and his fate was now intertwined with the future of the Tan Dominion. As the door slid shut behind them, James turned to Liana, his gaze softening. We'll get through this, he said, more to reassure himself than her. Liana looked at him then, her expression guarded but not without a hint of gratitude. I hope so, she said quietly. Together, they stood in the silence, waiting for the unknown to come, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything James had experienced on the battlefield, heavier than the moment before impact, heavier than the seconds before a decision that could end a life. It was not fear. It was anticipation. A low chime echoed through the chamber, soft but precise, like a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing. The walls around them shifted, panels sliding open to reveal a wide viewport. Beyond it, the vastness of space stretched endlessly, filled with the looming silhouettes of the Tan Dominion fleet. Dozens of warships drifted in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting distant starlight like silent guardians. James stepped closer to the glass, his breath catching as he took it in. Back on Earth, he had seen satellites, aircraft carriers, missile systems. This was something else entirely. This was power on a scale that did not ask for permission. They are not here for war, Liana said quietly behind him. James turned, surprised. Her voice was steadier now, her strength returning with each breath. Then why bring an entire fleet? He asked. Liana hesitated, then stepped beside him, her reflection merging with his against the glass. Because they are afraid. James frowned. Afraid of what? She looked at him, and for the first time since he met her, there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not uncertainty, something deeper. Afraid of what you represent. The words settled slowly, like dust after a storm. James almost laughed, but it caught in his throat. I am just a guy who ran out of oxygen, he said. No, Liana replied softly. You are the one who gave it away. Another chime sounded, this time sharper. A signal. The chamber doors opened again, and the armored escort returned, motioning them forward without a word. James followed, his boots echoing against the metallic floor, his mind still caught on what Liana had said. They moved through a narrower corridor this time, darker, more enclosed. The air felt different here, tighter, like the ship itself was holding its breath. They entered a circular room at the center of the vessel. The floor was illuminated with faint lines of light, forming patterns that pulsed slowly like a living circuit. At the far end stood the queen once more, but she was not alone. Around her, several figures stood in silence, each one radiating presence, authority, expectation. A council. James felt it immediately. This was not a welcome. This was judgment. The queen did not speak right away. She watched him, not as a ruler looks at a subject, not as an enemy looks at a threat, but as someone trying to understand something that did not fit inside her world. Step forward, she said. James did. One step, then another. The room seemed to grow quieter with each movement. You gave your life support to someone who was not your own kind, the queen said. Why? There it was. Not a command, not an accusation, a question. James did not answer immediately. He thought about the cave, the cold air, the way Liana's breath had sounded before it stabilized, the way she looked at him when she woke up. He swallowed, then spoke. Because she needed it more than I did. No speech, no grand statement, just truth. The room did not react, but something changed. Subtle, invisible. The Queen's expression shifted, just slightly. And if that choice had ended your life? She asked. James met her eyes. Then at least one of us would have made it. A pause. Longer this time. One of the council members moved slightly, as if unsettled. Another lowered their gaze. Lyanna stood behind him, completely still. The Queen stepped closer. Not threatening. Not distant. Close enough that James could see the reflection of himself in her eyes. In our empire, she said quietly, strength is measured by survival. She paused. But you, another step closer. You chose something else. James did not move. The Queen turned slightly, addressing the council without breaking the moment. This is why they fear humans, she said. Not because of their weapons. Her voice softened, almost reflective. But because they do not always choose to live. Silence followed. Heavy. Meaningful. Then the Queen looked back at James. You will not be tested as a soldier, she said. You will be tested as something far more dangerous. James frowned slightly. What is that? The Queen held his gaze. A human. And for the first time since the ships filled the sky, James realized this was never about the war. The chamber did not move, but something inside it had shifted, like a quiet recalibration of everything that mattered. James stood there, still catching his breath, not from lack of oxygen this time, but from the weight of being seen in a way he had never been seen before. Not as a soldier, not as a human, but as a choice. The Queen turned away from him slowly, her robe catching the ambient light like liquid dusk, and for a moment it felt like the entire fleet beyond those walls was listening. Prepare the envoy, she said to the council, her voice calm, certain. We will not answer fear with force. One of the council members stepped forward, hesitation clear in the way their shoulders held tension. Your Majesty, the outer factions will interpret this as weakness. The Queen did not turn back. Then let them misunderstand, she replied. It would not be the first time someone failed to understand humanity. Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy. It was resolved. James exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding tension in places he did not know could carry it. Lyanna stepped beside him again, closer this time, no distance between them now. You changed something, she said softly. James shook his head. I just made a call. She looked at him, a faint smile forming, fragile but real. That is what changes everything. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the viewport behind them activated again, revealing the fleet shifting formation. Not advancing, not retreating, aligning. Ships that had arrived like a storm now held position like a promise. James watched in silence. No explosions. No command shouted. Just motion. Intent. Restraint. They are standing down, he said quietly. They are choosing to wait, Lyanna corrected. Because of you. James almost argued, but the words never came. Somewhere deep down, he understood. It was not about him as a person. It was about what he had done without thinking about power, rank, or consequence. The Queen stepped back into view, her presence no longer distant, but not entirely close either. Something in between. Measured. Respectful. James Dawson, she said. His name no longer sounded like a label. It sounded like recognition. Your species has always been unpredictable. A slight pause. But today, that unpredictability gave us something we have not had in a long time. She looked toward the stars. An alternative. James followed her gaze. Endless black. Endless possibility. So what happens now, he asked. The Queen's answer was simple. Now we choose carefully. She turned to him one last time. You will return to your world. Not as a soldier sent back. A small pause. But as a message carried forward. James felt something tighten in his chest, but not from fear. From understanding. And what is the message? The Queen's eyes softened, just enough to be noticed. That strength is not proven by what you can take. Another pause. But by what you are willing to give when no one is watching. No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to add. The council stood quieter than before. The fleet held steady beyond the glass. Lyanna's hand brushed against his, not gripping, not asking. Just there. James looked at it, then at her, then back at the stars. He had arrived on this planet as a man trying to survive. He was leaving as something else entirely. Not a hero, not a symbol, just human. And somehow, in a galaxy built on power, that had been enough. The ships remained in silence as he was escorted away, but for the first time since they filled the sky, they did not feel like war. They felt like witnesses. And far above, reflected faintly in the glass, the stars did something unusual. For a brief moment, they looked back,